By way of introductions, I know a number of you in the audience, but not all. I'm Scott Christensen. I'm a vice president at Hellenic, and as a former CIO, director, manager of IT, I've kind of been in your shoes and walked a mile in them, if you will, balancing IT strategy, projects, and operational responsibilities. I've been with Hellenic about 5 years or so. A little bit about Hellenic. Hellenic has over 300 consultants. We are based in Chicago, Illinois, and we're a Microsoft Gold partner. We're a little different than your average Microsoft Gold partner. We kind of blend all that techie stuff that many Gold partners have, but we have a deep, rich experience in quality assurance and testing, and it kind of makes us uniquely qualified to help our clients with many of the challenges that they have. George?
Yep. Hello, everyone. My name is George Martinez. I'm a senior engineer here at Hellenic. I've been working here for right about 4 years now. I started in the Talent Academy and focused primarily on desktop engineering, which means I do primarily Windows 10 deployments and software deployments and anything really relating with the Windows 10 desktop.
Thanks, George. Today's session, we're going to start off a little bit with what we kind of talk about as the race to remote. All organizations had a component of remote access for various reasons, but of course, COVID pandemic hit with no warning, and it impacted us, and as we see from our clients, in very different ways. We had some clients that, frankly, had no laptops deployed. They were a desktop-only shop, and when COVID hit, it impacted them pretty negatively in the need to really beef up Citrix and other remote access capabilities. We were all scrambling for laptops, webcams, things like that, that we needed to handle those immediate requirements. Many of our law firm clients, some of you in the audience, were sort of scrambling to do video depositions and remote notary publics and things like that. And new software had to be deployed to kind of get that stuff out. Depending on the tools that you were using, that can pose many challenges in meeting those needs in that new environment. If we move on to the next slide, really the reality is that fire drill that we now know as COVID-19, we're realizing, hey, this is the new norm, right? And we're going to have to get used to more people working remotely. That concept is here to stay. And that causes a need for us to kind of rethink our projects, our deployments, our training, our support, and that leads to the idea that we might need some more modern tools for desktop management in light of that new norm. We kind of talk, what is the nirvana that we seek? What's our perfect picture of success in the future? And, in my definition, that we can manage all devices, anytime, anywhere. We can patch, we can push out and update applications, we can maybe image new machines and do all of that remotely and not have that, need to run into the office in order to, image a machine like we all might be doing today. And we want all that to work, and ideally with the same tools. It shouldn't really matter whether people's machines are remote or on site. We want a same consistent set of tools in order to do all of that. Now I'd like to turn it over to George. He's going to do the heavy lifting today in the webinar, and he's going to dig into the tech pieces of this, offer up a couple of case study examples, and talk about some modern tools that you can use to reach that nirvana. George?
Thank you, Scott. And to start off, I'd like to begin by talking about a shift in how we see IT's role in the future. And really, we want to talk about this transformation that we've seen from what we call traditional IT to something that we are now calling modern IT. And with this modern IT, it's really a mindset change, but also a tool change, and really seeing how we can manage these devices to reach that nirvana state that Scott had pictured in the previous slides. So one of the big things that we see that's different in traditional versus modern IT is just the speed at which things are going to change. So what we have seen in the past with Windows 10, with Office 365, is that they are in a much faster cadence of change. So we're seeing a new build of Windows 10 and a new build of Office twice a year, which is a much faster rate than what we've seen in the past, where it was updated once every couple of years. So being able to stay on top of that and manage that for all of your devices is already becoming a challenge in and of itself. but in allowing us to do that remote is also another challenge that IT now needs to be able to solve. And using some of these new tools that I will talk about is very possible. Another change that we're seeing is a big move away from high touch to self-service. And what I mean by that is a good example is applications like Zoom and Teams that needed to be deployed pretty widespread in the last month to a lot of clients, but not necessarily every single client in the organization. And what we saw a lot of our firms opt to do is to actually allow these applications to be self-serviced via the software center or via the company portal to allow users to then be able to by themselves download these applications without having to open up a help desk ticket, without having to rely on IT to do that for them on their devices. This saved them time and allowed them to get back to productivity faster than what would have otherwise been possible. Another change is a move away from legacy apps to what we now call software as a service apps. So things like Office, things like Adobe, things like Java Oracle are all now software as a service apps. This is primarily a licensing change, but with that licensing change, we have to kind of rethink the way that we can activate and license software, and a lot of the new cloud features that I'll talk about allow for that to be managed in a much easier manner than what we're used to in the past. And then as Scott kind of alluded to a little bit, the shift away from having a single business device to having multiple business and user devices that are going to have work email on them and are going to have work data. So we'll see a lot of users that'll have their Windows laptop, they'll have their Android phone, and they'll have their iOS tablet, and all three of those devices will have work email on them. And it's being able to manage and control those devices even when they're not business owned is something that we need to do in modern IT. And then of course the last point here that really ties all of this together is to move away from business networks towards home networks. With more and more people working remote, whatever management tools we use, we need to ensure work in this home network scenario. So I will preface by saying that we still see a lot of value in these traditional tools, but I do want to mention that we are seeing a shift away from some of these tools, and some of them are going through a little bit of a transformation to allow them to be more cloud friendly. And we'll kind of go through all of these tools in detail in the next coming slides. But for now, I'll kind of mention some broad issues with some of these tools and some of their weaker points that are alleviated by the cloud equivalents. So the big thing is the fact that they rely on on-premise technology and they have a lack of mobility. So for example, with SCCM, you can only really do deployments if your users are on your network. The moment that a user leaves your network, you can no longer talk to that client with the base SCCM. And we will talk about additional tools that can be added to SCCM to extend its functionality so that it can talk to people on the cloud. Server management is a big time and money sink with a lot of these tools. So being able to maintain these servers on a monthly basis, have your IT staff do the manual patching every month. They're difficult to scale. If you open up a new office, you have to build new distribution points, you have to build new networking components, and then also redundancy. You have to ensure that all of these servers are backed up in case of failure and that they are available no matter what happens in the organization. So here's the table that I will be coming back to a couple times in the presentation. So we will come back to this and I will kind of go through which tools we can use in different examples as we get to the end of the presentation. But for now, I will quickly go through each one of them just so we know what we're talking about today. And then we'll kind of talk about what each one of these tools is used for. So the first one, the most common one, is Active Directory. This has been around for a very long time and really every organization uses it. And it's your identity control scenario. So this will allow you to manage your users, their passwords, and any groups that they're going to be in. We have group policy, which allow you to do any Windows device settings. So you can set things like enforcing passwords and enforcing different settings from web browsers, for example. WSUS, which is Windows Server Update Services, and that's going to be to allow you to do your patching for your clients. So you can do Windows patching, you can do Office patching. Microsoft Deployment Toolkit, or SCCM, will allow you to do operating system deployments. You would only really use one or the other. And then under SCCM is really your big management workflow, which will have your applications, your patching, your operating system, and your settings. Moving to the modern side of IT, we are seeing tools like SCCM Cloud Management Gateway, or CMG. And this is a component that can be added onto SCCM to extend a lot of its functionality out to the cloud, so you can continue to use your investment in SCCM in the cloud. We will also talk about Intune and how that varies and what place Intune makes sense compared to SCCM CMG. And that is also a big management suite that'll control everything from settings all the way down to patching. And the last bit that'll make both of those work is Azure Active Directory, which is really an extension of your Active Directory out to the cloud. So we'll start today by talking about Azure Active Directory and really the three scenarios that we can deploy this in. The first scenario being not using Azure Active Directory and just having your on-premise Active Directory. And this is what we see in a traditional IT approach. And what we'll see here is we'll see that the users will join their local domain. The users will sign in with their local AD credentials. Application deployments are generally handled with SCCM or third-party tools, if those are in the organization. Settings and updates are either handled with SCCM or group policy or WSUS, depending on which one it is. But no cloud tools are really used here, and this falls into the same pitfalls as all the other traditional tools in that they don't support remote work and they don't have that scalability that you get when you move to the cloud. The second scenario here, which may be the nirvana for many organizations, is this Azure Active Directory only scenario. And in this scenario, you are focused for cloud-only deployments, and you're looking at really having a cloud-only environment. And what that means is that you don't actually need any local infrastructure to run this Azure Active Directory scenario. In this scenario, all of your devices will join your Azure Active Directory domain, not your local one. Your users will sign in with their Azure Active Directory credentials, not their local AD credentials, and all of your deployments, settings, and updates all handled via Intune and the cloud-provided services. And what this allows you to do is this actually allows you to remove all of your distribution points, all of your management servers, and be able to really host all of that from the cloud and be able to manage these users regardless of where they are, since there really is no local infrastructure or local network anymore. You're just looking at a cloud scenario. And then the third option that we see is that we often hear is overlooked whenever we talk to a client that is looking at the cloud for the first time is the hybrid Azure Active Directory scenario. And in this scenario, you actually get to use a little bit of best of both worlds. So you get to have your users join the Azure Active Directory in the cloud, as well as your local domain on the local environment. Your users can then sign in with either their local domain credentials as they've been doing or their Azure Active Directory credentials. And then here's really the key part. You now have the ability to choose which tool you want to use to manage those devices. So you have the option to continue to use your investments in SCCM. You have the options to migrate some of those components over to Intune, and that can be done at a per role scenario. So you can migrate your application deployments, but not your settings. You can migrate your updates, but not your application deployments, and you can really pick and choose where it makes most sense for your organization based on your current infrastructure. So looking at those three scenarios, we're looking at the third one, the hybrid Azure Active Directory. A very common one is going to be extending SCCM to the cloud using Cloud Management Gateway. And Cloud Management Gateway is actually really cool in the way that it works. So it's a service that runs on Azure's infrastructure. So this is running up on Microsoft's cloud. It spins up a server for you, and it gives you essentially a cloud distribution point up on Microsoft's Azure portal. And you don't have to manage that server. You don't have to manage its resources. You don't have to worry about updating. All of that is handled automatically. And all you really have to do is just build it once and really just leave it alone for the rest of the time. What this will allow it to happen is that SCCM will connect to that online service and be able to then deploy things to your clients regardless of whether or not they're on your on-premise or not on your network. So you gain the ability to do your software updates and endpoint protection updates. You gain the ability to do inventory and client status. You gain the ability to do compliance status, so you can check on BitLocker or other settings like that. You gain the ability to do software deployments and also Windows 10 in-place task sequence deployments. The things you don't gain the ability to do is you do not gain the ability to do any bare metal deployments. So for example, PXE booting is not something that you can do via Cloud Management Gateway, but you can really do everything else that you have in SCCM in this scenario. And this is really nice because this allows you to continue to use your existing workflows just moved to the cloud. So if your organization already has ADRs, your organization already has Software Center, and your users are already using that to self-service application installs, you can continue to use all of those tools with the same interfaces moving into the cloud. This tool also allows your end user experience to be very consistent. If your users are expecting that they will receive a pop-up message on Fridays that say, hey, updates will be deployed, your computer needs to reboot in the next 8 hours, those messaging and those UIs will continue to be exactly the same as they migrate over to the cloud environment. So juxtaposing that a little bit with Intune, which is a different tool for Microsoft that can be used in conjunction with that. Intune is a tool that allows you to manage a lot of the same settings that SCCM does, but in a much more cloud-focused manner. So this has no infrastructure components whatsoever. It's completely hosted on Microsoft's cloud. It extends SCCM by allowing you to have more in-depth control of other non-Windows devices, such as iOS, Android, and Mac OS. And it'll do a lot of the same things as far as application deployments, setting management, autopilot, which is our imaging scenario, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later, and patching. The big thing with Intune is that since it's using like strictly cloud-based components, you never have to worry about people being on your network. So we'll break down each one of these scenarios and we'll go through them one by one. So the first thing is application deployments. And this is one of those areas that I really do feel that Intune has excelled in very much in the last couple of years. So they have a couple different application types that you can deploy. And this is not the complete list. This is just the ones for desktops that I thought were important to mention. So they have a quick deployment for the new Edge, where you can set this up to automatically pull and deploy the newest updates to Edge so that it goes out to all your users. Likewise, Office 365 has its own portal, so you don't need to worry about having them host any Office 365 updates, since this is already going to be coming from Microsoft. You can integrate your Windows Store, and a lot of applications that we see people downloading from the store are the two that are listed there, iTunes and OneNote for Windows 10. Those are applications that often end up having to be on the user's device, and having them come down through the store allows them to be automatically updated and without the need to have to manually have IT have to do that. You can do web links. So if you have any web applications, you can set those up to go via Intune as well. And then the last one, which is really the biggest one and the most exciting one, is you can do all of your legacy Win32 applications. So if you have an MSI, if you have a setup.exe, if you have BAT files, if you have PowerShell scripts that you need to deploy, you can do all of that in Intune now. You can upload all of your custom files. You can upload a custom command line. And just like SCCM, you can specify whether or not to do system context or user context for these deployments. You can set up detection rules, and you can even set up requirements and return codes so ensure that the application did install successfully. This is all managed in a very similar manner to SCCM, but instead of using Software Center, you're going to be using a program called Company Portal, which I have pictured here. Very similar to SCCM, the users can go in there, they'll receive all of their required applications. They will also see all of their available applications and be able to pick and choose what gets installed for their devices. Another area of Intune is setting control, and this is really the space where group policy would have dominated in the on-premise environment. Intune now has a lot of that functionality built in, and in a much cleaner UI, I would say. So they have several different types of policies that you can apply, and you can see here in the list that I have on the right, it's a large number. But the one at the very top there is the one that I really want to talk about, which is administrative templates. And what Microsoft has essentially done is they've built a new UI for a lot of these settings, like delivery optimization, joining the domain, things like Windows updates. They have built a brand new UI for most of those settings, but for the ones that they have not built a new UI for, they've actually gone ahead and grabbed the administrative templates from group policy and brought them into Intune. So you can deploy your existing group policy templates directly from Intune and continue to have that go out to users even when they're not on the network. So things like Office settings, things like Edge settings are all going to be available inside of that administrative templates bundle. Some of the benefits that you actually get here versus group policy are applicability rules as well as reporting. So you can define who these rules will apply to based on very specific queries that you can set up. So you can say things like only apply these settings if the device is 1909, or only apply the setting if the device has Office installed. And you can also do reporting, which is a very huge thing. You can actually get readouts of which devices have or have not received the policies and why. and whether or not there's conflicting policies. And then the last thing is you also get the ability to do PowerShell scripts. So in case there is a setting that is not in any of these boxes that they've provided, you actually have the ability to write a custom script and have that deployed as a configuration setting, just like everything else. The last thing I will talk about for Intune before we get into patching is going to be Autopilot. And with Autopilot, this is their new OS deployment methodology. And this one is really a big shift. So the last two we've seen have been very similar to what we're doing already in traditional IT, but just extending to the cloud. And in Autopilot, it is very different. So Autopilot allows you to customize the out-of-box experience for your Windows 10 devices, and it'll allow you to automate a lot of tasks right on the beginning of the OS, such as joining the Azure domain, having applications install, setting up settings, setting up Wi-Fi. You can even do domain joins if the device is on the network. And with Autopilot, you really have two different options that we can explore. The more traditional one is that you would have Autopilot sent to IT. So you would have one of the vendors listed above or below here, Dell, HP, Lenovo, Microsoft, or Toshiba, send the device directly to IT. IT will then provision that for Autopilot. When they first turn on that device with the built-in Windows 10 image, it'll go through a customized out-of-box experience since it is registered to that organization. It'll then automatically install all the applications that you've assigned, do all the setting configuration, and what you'll get at the very end is you'll get a device that is pre-configured for your organization with only your organization software and only your organization settings that can then be handed over to a user. And all of those things are going to be coming down from Azure, so it doesn't actually require any infrastructure. And because it doesn't require any infrastructure, we actually unlock a new capability that we don't have currently in SCCM, which is the ability to send these devices directly to the user and have the user automatically configure them by simply opening up their device, connecting it to the Wi-Fi, and waiting for it to run all of the configuration steps. So what this means is that when it comes time to replace somebody's computer, you can actually work a deal with Lenovo to have them ship that device directly to your end users, have the end users automatically have their device configured without ever having to come to the office, without IT ever having to touch the device. With Intune, you get all of your reporting, so you know exactly what happened on that device, and you can really get your users up and running very quickly. The last area of Intune that I will talk about is patching. So OS patching and Office patching are become a very big thing. And we've seen with this recent shift to working remote, a lot of hesitance in deploying patches from a lot of our firms. We've seen some firms slow down a little bit in how aggressive they want to do their patching. We've seen other firms make patching available instead of forcing them to be required. And with Intune, and you actually get the ability to kind of continue to do what you're already doing, just moving forward. So Intune has a new UI for patching. They will actually use the built-in Windows 10 settings UI. So this is a screenshot of that. And this is more for the end user perspective of it. Instead of receiving SCCM pop-up messages that say you have new patches available, you actually just receive Windows 10 update messages, very similar to what they have at home, but it's controlled by IT. So you can see here on the right, I've scheduled these updates to be deployed, so the user can't actually decide when they are going to be installed. The user also can't pause the updates. These are all settings that I've been able to fine-tune control with Intune. And you can also control when the reboot happens, which is really the biggest thing. And you can control the reporting of when reboot is going to happen. So you can still do things like persistent pop-up messages that will stay on the screen until the reboot happens and things like that. Here's an example of one of the most common ways of configuring this. Auto install and restart at a scheduled time. So as you can see here, I've set this up so at the second week of every month on Tuesday at noon, it's going to install patches and then ask the user for a restart. You can then configure how long before that restart is enforced and different things like that. So you can say within 8 hours of 12, you can force that restart. That timing is obviously a little rough for the user right in the middle of the day, but you can fine tune that to whatever time works best for your organization. And the last thing I'll mention here before I hand it back to Scott to talk a little bit about the value of testing is ring deployments. And with ring deployments is a system in where you can actually set up these patches to go out to different groups in different intervals. So Olenek believes that this is very essential to getting patches deployed out and really should never go directly to the firm, just to ensure that there's no issues with any of the patches that are going to be deployed. So a good example of how this can be set up is you can have a small IT ring of maybe 3 to 4 users that receive the patches first. You can then have a slightly larger ring of, let's say, 10 to 12 users in a test group. Then you have even more users in the pilot group, and that number will depend on your organization, how many people you have for a pilot. And then you can have a firm group at the very end, which will receive the patches much later than everyone else. And you can then configure, even within firm, smaller subsections of your organization. So you can do things like your Chicago office, you can do things like your New York office or any of your other locations as different subsections of your firm deployment. And in Intune, you can see on the top here, you can actually have all of those configured in a very easy to read manner and understand exactly when those updates are going to be deployed. So at the very top, you can see that once an update is deployed, it will immediately go out to the test group. 7 days after that, it'll go out to the pilot group. And then 14 days after that, it'll go out to the firm. Now with that, I'll hand it over to Scott to talk a little bit about the value of testing.
Thanks, George. As George mentioned on the last slide, ring deployment is great. It is the primary tool that we and our clients use to mitigate deployment risk. But from our perspective, it's really not enough. We see time and time again companies that roll out to IT and then they roll out firm-wide in deployment. We've all been burned in some scenario in the past, and rolling something out that gave us a headache on Monday morning or Wednesday morning if it's Patch Tuesday, and various things break and cause us deployment headaches if we've got complicated and fragile desktops where integration breaks due to those things. The other point I'll make here is that IT staff, are not the best beta testers. They have elevated rights, and often they're focused in other things. And quality assurance and deep testing is really not their area of expertise or interest. I do have clients that have said, oh, I'm not that concerned about that kind of stuff. I'll roll it out and my pilot users will let me know if I've got a problem. And in our world, that's really too late, right? Pilot users letting us know we've got a problem, we've already let the genie out of the box, if you will. And we believe from a Lennox perspective that building in processes, having a more disciplined and structured approach to testing is a better way to handle that. And while some of the new tools that George has described have balances and trade-offs, again, in this post-COVID world, improved ability to support remote workers are going to be the key things that we're going to be looking for in deployment tools going forward. And ultimately, we want to have, sort of that nirvana of, the best tools available, the right testing in place to mitigate risk, and then we get the appropriate risk-reward benefit, if you will. As a final point on testing, we're a big testing company, obviously. Tests can be automated. So if we think of running through a test of click this this is an expected result. There are tools available today to automate that kind of testing. And we see many of our clients, ask for some help in doing that kind of automation. And that takes some of that manual rigor out of the need to test everything before you end up deploying it to production. George, I'll turn it back to you. I believe you have some case study examples.
Yes, I do. We talked a lot about the tools and how they can be used, but I feel like the best way to really understand when you should use which tool is to really look at an example. And I've kind of created two companies here that are going to show two very common scenarios that we see, and we're going to try to figure out how we can solve some of their problem statements using some of these new tools. And I'll bring back that slide that I had mentioned earlier with the table and talk about where they were and where they're going to be migrating to. So I'll start with company A here, which is a very common example of an SCCM organization. They're slightly larger than most, and we'll go through their current environment right now. So they deploy their patches using Software Center, and this is going to be patches and software deployments. So let's say they do their Office 365, they do their OS, and they also do all of their applications, third-party or Microsoft with SCCM. They currently have Azure Active Directory. They're set up in a hybrid scenario, so they still have on-premise environments. Hence they have SCCM and Active Directory and group policy, but they've added a very basic Azure AD tenant just to support Office 365. Currently, the firm uses an on-demand VPN to support a small number of users. And what I mean by on-demand VPN, I mean a VPN that the user needs to go and manually enable. So they need to open up their start menu, launch their VPN client, and connect to the organization. And that is a big contrast from something like an always-on VPN, which will just always work and allow your users to kind of be perpetually on the network. And then the vast majority of their users work in the office. So they do have a handful of users that are permanently remote. They have a handful of users that work remote some of the time, and those users primarily use that on-demand VPN to connect back to office resources when they need to. So the problem statement for them: recent events have caused most of the office to work remote. Patching and application deployments have been inconsistent since some users don't connect to the VPN. Imaging is difficult as it involves IT having to come into the office to provision the device and ship it to the user. And a desire to support mobile devices and personally owned devices has recently been added to the organization. So with these different scenarios, these are very common. These are things that we are all kind of working through when it comes to moving away from business networks to the cloud. Your users having inconsistent deployments because they're not on VPN is really caused by that on-demand VPN connection. And oftentimes the big one that we see is that organizations will have software patch deployments set up to go at 10 p.m. at night, but their users have closed their VPN at the end of their day at 5 o'clock, and now that connection has been cut and the deployment doesn't happen. So that's a very common thing that we're seeing. We're getting a lot of more inconsistent numbers when it comes to reporting because of that. So what are some of the solutions? How can we alleviate some of those problems? So we'll start with the patching and applications issue. So in order to provide remote patching and application deployments to internet clients, we can use Cloud Management Gateway to extend their SCCM up to the cloud. So I had talked a lot about this in the last couple slides here, but with this new system, they can now handle all those deployments, have very consistent results, and essentially get the same results of what they were seeing in the office, but remote. Further plans to enable co-management can begin once they've done that, and co-management will allow them to then decide whether or not they want to move certain workflows from SCCM over to Intune. So they can then decide, hey, you know, we still want to handle package deployments, but as far as patching, we want that to just go automatically from Microsoft. We don't want that touching our infrastructure, even if they're on the on-premise environment, and just have it happen automatically without having to ever think about it. The next scenario, remote imaging. In remote imaging, as the company begins to move the workflows to Intune, they will unlock the ability to pre-configure with Autopilot, and this will allow them to do that whole scenario where they can ship devices directly to the user and have that pre-configured. And this will reduce the amount of time needed to get a user up and running. It'll also remove the need to have IT have to go to the office to get a new device configured for the end user. And then the last section that we had talked about was the desire to support mobile devices and any personally owned devices. And with Intune, they can actually start to manage a lot of those iOS and Android devices and ensure basic configurations, things like ensuring that there is a passcode on the device, ensuring that it has encryption enabled, ensuring that it's not jailbroken or rooted for Android or iOS. And they can actually do that without needing to go to Intune for their desktop applications. So they can continue to go SCCM Cloud Management Gateway, use SCCM for all of their desktops and laptops, and then in parallel, have Intune configured for mobile device management or mobile application management without really having to cross the two until the organization is ready to then do so at some point in the future. So looking at this table again, this firm started with Active Directory, they used group policy, they used SCCM. They did not use WSUS or MDT. And what we're suggesting as a solution for them is to move to Cloud Management Gateway, so one column over from SCCM, with the eventual movement from there over to Intune to then allow for less infrastructure and kind of alleviate some of those infrastructure issues that they've seen in the past. They already had Azure Active Directory, and as they move to Intune, they will be expanding on their use of that a little bit, but that is a prerequisite for some of those tools that we had just talked about. Another company, Company B, which is another great example of a maybe smaller organization, not an SCCM organization. And I'll kind of go through their environment now. So they deploy their patches with WSUS. So all of their OS and Office patching again is going through WSUS. They do not manage their software deployments currently, at least not with any Microsoft tools. A lot of organizations will use third-party tools in this space, but for the example here, they're not managing it. And what that means is that what is installed in their operating system or in their image is what gets deployed to the users. And whenever there is an update to that organization, or whenever there is any kind of one-off application that needs to be installed, that needs to then be handled by IT or help desk in this particular firm. They currently don't have any cloud investments, so they're strictly on-premise, don't have Azure AD Connect or anything like that configured. And then the firm only has desktop devices. And this is something that we actually saw during the initial lockdowns. So because of the initial lockdown, users had taken their desktops home and connected via VPN back to the network. So the problem statement: the firm wants to support more remote work, then they see that this is not going to be a thing that's going to go away. So they're going to have to come back to supporting remote work as well as on-premise work. The firm is going to begin by purchasing new laptops and wants to find a way to quickly provision them and get those sent out to the user without having to do any kind of on-premise handoff. And patching should be updated to support remote users, as well as applications should be brought under IT control. So this organization, unlike the last one, is actually a perfect candidate for going to an Azure Active Directory only scenario. So this organization actually has the option to opt in to remove their local AD environment and really focus primarily on a cloud only scenario. They can remove all of their infrastructure if need be and have all of their devices reporting back to Azure, and then start using Intune for their entire management workflow, from patching to applications, even down to imaging with the new autopilot system. So you can see how it really depends on where your organization currently is, how much infrastructure you have, and how many users need to support will really help guide that decision as to where you will end up with either SCCM or Intune. One last thing I do want to mention here as far as application deployments, a Linux best practice is to package all software. It makes it much more consistent if you have packaged all software, and really the rule of thumb is if you've installed it once for a user, odds are you're going to have to install it again at some point in the future. So packaging the software will allow you to put it in Intune, will allow you to deploy it via autopilot, but also will allow you to deploy it in the future in the event that the user's device needs to be reconfigured without having to dig up an old documentation if there is one, or try to find the person who originally configured it for that user. So this organization, they were much smaller, so they had Active Directory, they used group policy, and they had WSUS as their three main tools that they were using. And what we're actually suggesting here is that they pull back their use of WSUS, group policy, and Active Directory, and in favor of using Azure Active Directory and Intune to really manage those exact same workflows, but in a more modern, future cloud-based system. So these are two very specific examples, but to fully understand what your organization will look like, we will require a much larger discussion. And with that, I'll hand it over to Scott.
Thanks, George. I appreciate that. You know, we are reminded that there is no one size fits all for these types of scenarios. And George, can you slip ahead one slide? Thank you, appreciate that. I'm showing my age a little bit, but some of you of my vintage may recall Ron Popeil, sort of the king of what we now know as the infomercial, selling products for Ronco. But the funny thing to me is he made a household phrase out of the term "set it and forget it," and you know, we sort of laugh and joke about that. But at the end of the day, I think there's a bit of a parallel with some of the new cloud deployment tools that George just talked about. There's a little less of a focus on engineering with some on-prem tools, and a little bit more focus on using some of the flexible cloud management tools that work to manage devices no matter where they are anytime. And in our world, then you can spend a little bit more time focusing on things like testing and quality control to make sure that your deployments go smoothly. As a reminder, before I close out and we take questions, we're going to take questions in the chat box. Most of you are on mute, but we do have a question box for you to voice questions. And if you could use the next minute or two to send your questions through, we'll be happy to address them. As we wait for the questions to come through, finally, if you'd like more information about what you've heard today, certainly reach out. Alenic would be happy to help in any way that we can. I want to emphasize there is no one size fits all. We talked, about a number of existing premise products that you might use. We talked about some future, more modern deployment tools that are Microsoft centric. Really, there is no one size fits all. At the end of the day, this is a customized decision. And as George pointed out, you don't have to do it all at once. You can use pieces of some of these more modern tools, and a gradual migration in that direction might be the right program for you. A popular offering that we have would be a 1 to 2 day envisioning exercise, if you will. Look at your tools that you're using today, what your challenges are, what your goals are, and kind of map out getting to that nirvana that we want to all get to. As a reminder, pop your questions in the box. And George, we do have one question that's popped up already. And the question is, can Intune be used for deployment or patching of non-Microsoft applications? Is it the proper tool to be deploying non-Microsoft stuff? Can you comment on that?
Yes, that's a very good question. So if you're looking at the Intune updates section by itself, the Intune's update section is the equivalent to Windows Update for Business, which means that updates Microsoft products exclusively. It does also do drivers, so it does things like your dock drivers and any of your other keyboard, mouse, graphics drivers that you'll get for your hardware. But when it comes to third-party applications, and I'm going to use Chrome as an example here, let's say you wanted to package and deploy a version of Google Chrome. The way that you can do that in Intune is by just that. You grab the newest version of Chrome, you have IT package it so that it's an automatic install, and you can upload that to Intune as an application and then have that deployed out to your users. So it is very possible to do application deployments, but not under the update section, similar to how it would work currently in SCCM. If you're an SCCM shop, it would function the exact same way.
Thank you, George. And related to that, it's sort of auxiliary, but we've had clients ask us about, should I make the Windows Store available to end users or end user devices? Can you give us an example of, because the initial thought is, why would I do that? That's mostly, games and toys and things like that. And most of my apps are Win32 apps and are not in the Microsoft Store. Why would you make the store available? Can you give an example of our recommendations why the store should be available in a Windows build?
Yeah, I can actually point out two very specific examples. Actually, we'll make it three. In the last few weeks, Microsoft deployed a new security zero-day vulnerability thing, and they actually deployed that via the Windows Store instead of their traditional WS/US deployments. So having the store at least configured on a user's environment to be running is a security concern. You want to make sure that that is in place and functioning to ensure that you receive all of the newest updates. So that's a kind of more security end of it. Another example would be drivers. So what we actually have seen at Alenic already is we've had a client who purchased a dock for one of their laptops, and the dock drivers were actually a UWP application that came down via the Windows Store. And it would update regularly enough that the firm actually opted to just have that available via the Windows Store to have that automatically go out to those devices. The third thing that I'll mention is iTunes is surprisingly a requested feature pretty often. We have a lot of users who end up using it to pull pictures off of their phone, which they'll use for business reasons. And so organizations end up having to support iTunes and have it deployed to the organization. But a lot of times they don't want to put a lot of IT resource into managing and re-updating it every single time there's a new update released to it. And since that is now a Windows Store application, that's a very common one that we see deployed. And I guess I'll finish this question by saying that when we say enable the Windows Store, there is different sections of the store that you can enable. So there's something called a private store for business, which you can configure. And what that'll essentially do is that when you first open the Windows Store, instead of getting the traditional consumer screen that has games and movies and music, you'll actually get what is a private store that'll say your organization's name on the top and only have the whitelisted applications that you've added. So that's a very good way to be able to control what the users see there and what actually gets deployed. And with the integration with Intune, you can even go a step further and have all those applications show up in company portal directly without having to have them show up in the, without having the user have to use the company store UI at all.
Thanks, George. We have seen some companies that have not put the store in their image, and then the ability to add it back later is kind of tough. So as George kind of described, you know, you want the store and the capability to access it in the image, even if you lock it down, don't have anything in there, or in the example that George gave, have a, you know, a curated company store and only have the stuff in it, like that docking station driver that you want your users and their machines to access. It looks like we don't have any other questions for now, so we appreciate everyone's time today, and certainly reach out if we can help you in any way. Thank you for your time today, and enjoy. Take care.